He had introduced this subject of faith back in chapter 10 when he's encouraging the Hebrew believers to persevere in their faith, to not let their faith wander, not let it drift, as he said, New International Version, don't throw away, verse 35, your confidence. And he's not talking about losing your religion, but he's talking about, just as we often get as believers, we get discouraged, we get frustrated, we get angry, we get upset, and our confidence in God and what he can do tends to weaken. It's not that you've lost your relationship with God, but certainly your fellowship with God has suffered, and out of that you're just not enjoying the benefits and the hope, the expectation of the reward that we have laid up for us in heaven. And he said in verse 36, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. And he goes in from a quote in verse 30, last part of 37 and part of 38 from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. And then he wraps up that chapter by saying, we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but we are of those who believe and are saved. And in talking about faith, he moves us into that, and we got into that last week. And in verse 3, he gives to us the first great example of what faith, as he defined it in verse 1, being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. And he gives an example of this in verse 3. He said, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Now, as one commentator notes, the believer looks at the universe in faith, that God created it, which gives us a moral element to an intellectual perception of the universe. That's the universe, Whereas those who do not believe look at the universe from a sense perception. In other words, they see the stars, they see the planets, they see the nebulae through the James Webb telescope. They're seeing, what they say is, almost up to 300 million years right after the universe was created. And they look at it from the standpoint of just the sense perception. This is what we see. These are the operations we understand. The difference in what the believer does when we look at the creation of the universe and we see that we believe that God created it, it gives a sense of obligation, it gives a sense of accountability to a power that's greater than all of the universe. Whereas those who do not know Jesus Christ, scientists, so forth and so on, who do not profess Christianity, they look at it from that total sense perception of, well, this is how it works. If we understand how it works, then we can better understand what. This is why I put this why. Why do we spend such obsessive amounts of time as humanity on what's out here? How many billions and billions of dollars have been spent worldwide trying to get to the moon, trying to circle Mars, trying to see if we can actually live on one of these planets, see if there's another inhabitable planet out here in the vast cosmos? Why do we do this so much? What's driving us? And we can go back to a couple of passages of Scripture. First is Genesis 3 verses 5 and 6. The deception that took place with Adam and Eve was that you will be like God. You will have knowledge of good and evil and wisdom. So that element of being wise as God, was one of the things that pulled Adam and Eve into that sin, into following Satan, eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And one commentator notes that we feel like aliens in the world of time, and we yearn to be part of eternity. We also desire to understand our place in the universe against the backdrop of eternity. We are not able to discern any plan or pattern to all of this. As they look at this from an empirical standpoint, there's no pattern, there's no, understanding of this. And because of this, we as humanity have a sense of alienation and bewilderment in time. How many times have you heard something on either TV or some news saying that, we're trying to understand our place. And we can't be the only living intellectual beings in the entire universe. If you don't have a belief here, you naturally have the confusion of, really? In a universe that is 14 billion years old, according to them? I don't know how old it is. God knows. I believe he created it, and it really doesn't make any difference to me. He made it ever how old it is, or ever how young it is. But we look at all this and say, how can we be the only ones here? I don't understand how we were the only planet in our entire galaxy, and there's billions of galaxies. They don't understand that. It creates a confusion, a sense of alienation, and we want to find out why we're here. But it's interesting. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, Solomon addresses some of this. He says in that passage that God has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11. God has set eternity, a sense that there is a forever in the hearts of men. It's a stamp, if you will, of what God placed in us when he created us. A moral stamp that we are not a dog. We're not an animal. We are a distinct, created being by God. And he set eternity in us. And we're wondering, where do we fit? And we can't do that on our own. Again, in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 17, Solomon writes, no one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all of his efforts to search it out, man cannot discover its meaning. Even if a wise man claims he knows, he cannot really comprehend it. In other words, Solomon is saying that mankind seeks to discover the key to master life, to know what he must do to bring prosperity, happiness, and long life, and thus to control life. That's what we're looking to do. All of the technology, all the advancements, all that we're trying to do. We're trying to control our life and find out how we can live forever, how we can be happy. I saw some news tag, I didn't read it. They found a part of the brain that if you stimulate this part of the brain, you'll be happy forever. I don't know what drug they're using for that, but that's what they say. But we're seeking to control that. Yeah. And that's what I need is another hole in my head, where they can attach something.
That's kind of ironic because if you look at studies, like teens are the unhappiest they've ever been. People are not satisfied, but yet we've got all this scientific knowledge.
Yeah, we've made so much progress in so many areas, in so many things, and we're the most unhappy that we've ever been. Why? Because most of mankind stops here. We're looking at the edge of the universe. If we can go back and find out how the universe started, then we will understand how we got here, why we're here, and how we can move out into this whole universe. And as Ray Kurzweil well said, to control the cosmos. He said that. And the singularity is near. Mankind stops here. Thus, they're frustrated, unhappy. We believe. The Christian has an intellectual perception that gives us a moral idea that this universe isn't a freak accident, but came as part of God's plan for the aspect of his character of grace to be revealed. When you step beyond this and see here, it changes your whole perception of this. So, when he says in verse 3, by faith, we understand that the universe was created. He's just saying there's a whole lot out there, a whole lot you need to understand, a whole lot we can't understand. But if we look above it and see the creator of it, we understand enough to have a relationship with God. Now, there's a lot of efforts made by Christian apologists to show that the universe had to be created and not evolved. I'm not going to get into all of that because there's just tons of this. But there's one passage that I read in a book by Stephen Meyer called The Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. And he states on page 219 of that book, in the chapter on Beyond the Reach of Chance, this is a quote from him: "The universe itself does not possess the probabilistic resources necessary to render probable the origin of biological information by chance alone." And he's talking about the creation of just the first bits of information that could grow into all of the animal and human world. He says the odds of producing a functional protein of modest length stand at less than one chance in a trillion. Now, I don't know how big a trillion is. I'm thinking it's probably about 25 zeros after whatever number you have. But he says the odds, there's not enough material. The universe has not endured long enough for one protein to be developed by chance. But I say that to say this: in the final analysis, we cannot prove that the universe was created by God. Now, you can't prove that it wasn't, but you can't prove that it was. In the final analysis, the world will always come up with a way of answering whatever we bring up and say, well, what about this? They'll use some kind of computer simulations in which they've already fed into the information that they want a certain outcome to come out of it, and they'll come out with this. So we can't prove it. Science can't. We can't. It goes back to belief.
It really is faith.
Yeah.
The analogy that I always try to use with somebody is the one with the watch. You got a watch on the zillion pieces, and you put it in the box, and you say, okay, how many times are you going to shake this box before you throw it out on the table and you have a watch there that's functioning? Is it possible to ever do that? And then if ever it is, then you go, okay, now take away those pieces and then create a watch. I mean, you have to have more faith that there is no God to believe that this happened by chance, I think, than to believe that there's a divine being that created it.
Yeah, I don't have enough faith to believe that out of absolutely nothing, all of this has come by chance. I don't have enough faith to believe that. I just don't. Because like you said, okay, if everything started from a little dot, and this is what science says. This is the entire universe right here. The size of less than an atom. And out of the Big Bang, all of this has come. And that happened by, they don't know. They believe that there was some maybe pre-existent universe. Okay. Keep running it back. Yeah, alien. Alien from where? I don't have enough faith to believe that. Huh? Roswell, yeah. Yep. And we got them hid in Area 51 or in Ohio somewhere, I think some of them were in Washington, D.C. Yeah. Yeah, and I'll leave that on the video. I won't take that out. But it comes down to belief. They look at all of these elements and they say, okay, we understand the operation of how things go, so we think that the universe is a closed system, which means there's no room for God, there's no room for miracles. It operates on basic laws of physics until you get to the quantum realm. Then they say physics goes out the window. All of that is way up here, way above my pay grade, And I'm retired, so my pay grade's way down here, so that's way up there. All of that. But they look at all of this and they say, okay, there has to be an understanding. And we think it's within the closed circle. Therefore, whatever we decide is either good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, it's fine. There is no accountability to some higher power because there isn't one. Going back to Ray Kurzweil, as someone said to him one time, do you believe in God? He said, not yet. Mankind is going to become its own God. That's when he'll believe in God. That's what they believe. That's why they have that's why we're seeing in our world the confusion that we're seeing. How so much now has twisted. When you can have all of this, but if you understand it came from here, it puts everything in an entirely different light. You can still learn all you want to learn about this. But the belief that it came from God gives you that sense of moral obligation. That for all I learn, I don't need to turn loose a virus on the world. For all I learn, I don't need to be able to chop somebody up and call them something that they were born different as. I don't need to do all of that because I have an obligation to Him who created it all and revealed Himself in this book. That's the power of what He's talking about. Now, why didn't God give us an empirically demonstrated explanation for the universe? Why didn't He do that?
Why should it?
Why should He?
Would you understand it?
No. We wouldn't.
If somebody twisted around and make it however they felt like that their vision was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if he had given us that in Scripture, we would want to see if we could do it ourselves. It ain't good enough that you said this is how you did it. We want to see if we can replicate it, And He wants us to believe and trust Him. In the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah in particular, He refers time and again that I created the heavens and the earth. I created. Before there was anything, I said this is how it's going to be. I created this. And He says, believe that. Trust me. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We haven't seen God, but we believe that He is. And there's an empty tomb that gives to us the empirical evidence, if you want empirical evidence, that says that all that He has said is true. You will never find Jesus' bones. They will not be found because they ain't there. He arose from the dead. The empty tomb is the proof of all that He has given to us in His Word. So I have spent, I guess, an inordinately amount of time on that verse. But in today's world, we need to get the fact of faith. We are, all of us are so empirically driven. I got to see it to believe it. That we had turned that into our religious perception. Well, if I don't see God, then evidently He ain't here. Faith. Faith. And he goes on. Questions, comments? Questions, clarifications?
Well, as we look, He's around us every day. Whenever the sun comes up, whenever the night falls, whenever the leaves change, whenever this, that. But man doesn't look at those things. They just happen. You know, the seasons.
Yeah, because of the way the world circles around the sun and the tilt. Yeah.
The birth of the animal, the survivability of the animals out in the woods. How do they survive? Who gives them what they, they put a chip in their head and say, okay, this is where you go to find your water, and this is where you find your food. There's miracles around us every day. Wind, if they're poison and stuff in it, they can suck that out without major surgery, That's a miracle,
Heart transplant.
Yeah, huge, yeah. So I think there's a lot of God around us, we just don't zoom in on it, because a lot of times we're too busy to even think about those things, just like the sun coming up every day, the rain we get, those are blessings of God. But for Him, how messed up would our world?
Yeah. And God created man with the ability to be wise. We talked about that back in chapter 2. And we see evidence of that in all that we have, from a heart transplant to being able to suck infection out with a burst appendix to any number of things. We can see all of that. And God has given mankind the ability to be smart. But we have taken our smartness and turned it into, well, I'm smart enough to be God.
I think, if I can add there, I think the thing for me is the absoluteness of God. There's so much that we don't understand in this world. But to know that God is an absolute, that He is real, what He has said is true, whether I understand it or not,
Yeah.
that doesn't change who He is or what He is doing.
Yeah.
Because in Hebrews, as he goes along, he's going to give us examples of people who have had faith in God and how that faith was put into action and exhibited. And then I've been studying for weeks now to verse 13, which I don't want to jump ahead of you guys. But it talks about those who, having received the promise, will never even see it.
Yeah.
And then it goes to how they accepted those, how they embraced those promises and took God at His word. It's like
Yeah.
Abraham, for example.
Mm-hmm.
He said, this is what God said.
Because he said it. Because he said it. Yeah, Kyle.
First comes to mind, that we're talking about here, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 21 says, "For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God,
Yeah.
it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe." So right there you have encapsulated, it takes faith,
Right.
because through wisdom, God made it so that man was not going to come to know him through wisdom, but through faith to
Yeah.
believe what he is.
Exactly, yeah. The carnal-minded individual, for all that they can accomplish, they still can't understand through wisdom how there could be a God who did all of this and how it all works. It takes the gift of faith. It takes God pricking that part of our wisdom that says there's something beyond this, and God gives you the faith to believe. Ephesians chapter 2, we're saved by grace through faith, that not of ourselves. It is the gift of God, because our wisdom can't take it all in. It takes faith. And it's not an existential leap. It's not some kind of like, oh, I really don't believe it's true, but I'm going to believe it anyway. No. Absolute. It is true. It is true. And we believe that and grow in our faith. We have faith. You don't need to get more. You just have it and you need to develop it. And he's going to talk about all these things. Look at what he says as it's demonstrated before the flood, verses 4 through 6. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, he still speaks, even though he's dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So, in the very first instance in Scripture of sacrificial worship, it was faith, not the offering itself. Abel's offering was accepted not because he had a lamb versus grain, but the faith that was involved. Both of these men evidently knew the history of Adam and Eve, their parents, and how that God slew an animal and clothed them after they sinned. Abel, in belief, saw this as the acceptable way to God is a blood sacrifice that provides you acceptance with God. Something had to provide the go-between. And he offered that. And God accepted it because he believed that. It was faith. Cain was rejected because he thought, well, what I'm doing myself ought to be accepted to God as good as what Abel is doing. I did this, he ought to accept it. No.
You mean I ought to get a trophy for finishing second?
Huh?
You should have got a trophy for finishing
Oh, yeah, yeah. Except with God, there isn't no second. You either win in salvation or you lose because you're lost. I mean, but he thought there ought to be at least a tie for first place or second. But no. You know, God wasn't bought off by Abel's offering. He looked at the heart. He looked at the attitude, the faith that drove the action. And faith, the faith of Abel, is what caused God to commend or witness to Abel being a righteous man. And as the writer to the Hebrews says here, that witness continues even to this very day. He said, and by faith he still speaks, even though he's dead. And then he goes to Enoch. And it's interesting as he talks about Enoch, because the Genesis account of Enoch states that he walked with God. And it's easy to take that phrase and play the holier than thou. He was so holy that God just took him to heaven. That's how good he was. And if you be as holy as I am, then maybe God will, you see how that can turn that direction. But Hebrews is very clear that the only reason he was accepted by God was because he believed. His walk with God was based upon faith in God.
But don't you think, Enoch has always fascinated me.
Yeah.
And the fact that I try to envision what kind of walk did that man have that was so different from everybody else that one day he just wasn't here. He's the only one in Scripture that I could just
That we know for sure.
that was that close to God that he didn't die.
Mhm. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
gotta think about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you see the same type thing with Elijah, that he was caught up into heaven. How holy did they live? Really isn't the question. They believed. And out of that belief, they lived a life that God chose to honor. It wasn't that they were so much better than any one of us in this room as far as their standing in God. Because as Hebrews is very clear, through Jesus Christ, we're perfect. You'll never get any better than you are right now positionally before God in Jesus Christ through faith. Now, we all live a little different than what we are positionally, unfortunately. But, it was faith. This is what commended him to God. And the writer says, without faith, look at what he says about him. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him.
Well, then you think about Job. Obviously, God loved Job.
Hmm?
And his experience is very different. According to what God does.
Yeah.
So,
When God brags on you, that's pretty good. He told Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No. That's pretty good. That's pretty good testimony. But instead of taking him away, he just said, go ahead, devil, have your best shot at him.
I mean, I
You
guess,
know.
I don't know, I was just thinking about the difference in the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's one of those things that, okay, the secret things, as, Jeremiah, or is it Deuteronomy 29, the secret things belong to God. There's some things that he does that he ain't going to tell you why he did it, because it basically isn't our business.
Well, I'll say
We're to trust him.
about, you have somebody that is religious and like they're always out and you're thinking maybe that's them, but then the thing with God is you hear about the lady that sit in her house and she's really, like she prays and writes letters and prays for people every day and nobody ever knows that. But the only thing that needs to ever come is their relationships between her and God. So that's where I think kind of like it's people that are living that direct relationship and like not necessarily people that like appear religious or things
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. Because that's who I always hear about, different people that wrote letters every day. There's still a lot of letter writers, a lot of prayers, a lot of people. And not even heard people say, well, I can't
Yeah, and I think in our age, and we're seeing it grow more and more, the persecution of being a Christian, that understanding that it's not necessarily being able to make it to a building. It's not whether I can, give a lot of money. But it's what is my relationship with Jesus Christ? Because there may very well come a time that we're not allowed to go to a building. There may very well be a time that our money is controlled by the government to the extent that you ain't given to a church, period. If you do, you will not have money to buy your groceries next week.
Well, I think the answer myself is in Hebrews chapter, verse 6 right there. It says, how do you please God? First you believe He is, and He's the rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. So, number one is just knowing that God is God.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to do what God tells me to do. We serve a religion anymore instead of a God. We want to do what the church has said we need to do. We want to do what we think we need to do. We want to do what the world tells us we need to do. And very rarely do we sit down and do what God has told me to do.
Mm-hmm.
For me, God has said, hey, this is what I want for you to do. And that may not make sense to anybody in the church building. But if that's what God has told me, that's what I need to do. And not doing that, he's falling very short of me. And Enoch, when we can look at Enoch, that's the kind of relationship he had, walking with God. He said, hey, I know this God is true. He is who He says He is. And this is what He's asked me. And that's what I'm going to do, whether that agrees with anybody else or not.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the essence, and is what he said. He must believe that He exists and that He is a rewarder of them who diligently seek Him. How good did Enoch live? He was a diligent seeker of God. That's all we know. And he sought God because he believed God. He didn't seek God because he was trying to get to God. He believed in God, and his life showed a demonstration of that belief and trust that God is worthy to be served. And I need to seek Him. I need to seek to develop the life that He wants me to live. And I like that emphasis there, because there's things that God knows that we need to follow in our individual lives that will help us grow, versus what He may expect the person sitting beside you to do to grow. It may not be an issue for them. It may not be a need for them. But it might be for you and me. And I think this is where we also get into trouble, because, well, if God told me I can't do it, then nobody can do it. I want everybody to be as miserable as I am because I can't do this, is what we're basically saying. And no, God may tell you that, no, this is not something that's good for your spiritual life. Then either do or don't do that. But now, because He's told you that doesn't mean He's told everybody that. I mean, that's where that legalism thing comes in. But this is the interesting thing about all this. You know, God rewards those who earnestly seek Him because you believe in Him and you want His pleasure in your behavior. That's what that's saying to us. I want to live so that God is pleased with my behavior. I believe in Him. Now I want to live like I believe in Him. Basically what that's after. And this goes back to what we've talked about a lot. Colossians chapter 1, verses 4 and verse 10. Because of your faith, live a life worthy of the Lord and please Him in every way. That's the will of God for every person's life. And it'll work out in numbers of ways, but that's the will of God for every person's life. Then he goes to Noah. And Noah's the last individual mentioned in the antediluvian or pre-flood examples. When Noah was warned of God, it was spoken by God Himself the Holy Spirit speaking. Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, the Lord said that my spirit will not always strive with man. But he found Noah, who was righteous in the eyes of the Lord because of his faith. He believed God. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. When God told him this, it was 120 years before it came to pass. Now, I don't know that he told him that early because it was going to take him that long to build that big a boat. Most of us think that's probably true. Could be, could not be. But he was also called in Scripture a preacher of righteousness. So he proclaimed during that 120 years, God's going to tear this world up. He's going to send something that has never been seen. Rain and a flood. Because if you read back, there was a great mist that circled the earth pre-flood. And in all probability, there had never been rains like what he was saying was coming. The world said, I ain't never seen it. So you're crazy, old man. Because he was, 500 years old when this happened?
I believe there were rings.
Huh?
Water rings.
Yeah, water rings, yeah.
In many ways, the world does it today, right? Where's he at?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It sure would be easy to float through water rings class, wouldn't it? That'd bring all of it.
Yeah, and also something else interesting about that, when the flood came, there's the phrase in that passage in Genesis that the fountains of the great deep were broken up. You know, how can the world be flooded? How can Mount Everest be covered with, you know? It's interesting, I read an article here a while back that scientists are saying that there is, for lack of a better term, a river of water under the crust of the earth that is more than is on the earth now. Oh. So maybe when the fountains of the great deep were broken up, you know, can I prove it? No. But God said it, this is how it's going to happen, and he made it happen that way. And science all of a sudden just finally stumbles on it at some point. Of course, science also said the reason we got our oceans is that it rained for 1,000,000 years. Okay. Literally, they say it rained for 1,000,000 years. That's one of the theories. One is that we finally got all the ocean from all the comets that kept hitting the earth. And because they have a lot of letters after their names, I'm supposed to just believe that. I'm sorry. This makes a whole lot more sense to me than that. But Noah condemned the world and received the rewards of those who earnestly seek him. Remember back in verse 6, because he was the one who was spared, he and his family. So I guess I'm going to have to stop with that. And we'll start with the Patriarchs of Israel next week. Thank you for the discussion. Thank Les and Donna for being a part of our class. I hope you have a good trip back to Oklahoma.